The heat of the afternoon clung to the air like a stubborn hand that refused to let go. Dust swirled with each passing bus, and the scent of exhaust wrapped itself around the street corners. At the busiest intersection in town, cars roared and horns snapped like angry voices, each vehicle rushing forward as if the world belonged only to their engines. The sidewalks trembled with noise, but in the middle of it all stood Amara Johnson. She was only 16, her shoes patched more times than she could count, her backpack stitched at the seams with mismatched thread. The weight of her schoolbooks pulled against her shoulders, but heavier still was the quiet responsibility of knowing she would work a late shift after classes, then hurry home to help her mother and younger brother. Amara had learned to keep her head high, even when her pockets were empty. She walked with steady steps, her chin lifted just enough to remind herself that dignity was free, even if almost everything else cost too much. She reached the curb, and the storm of traffic flashed before her eyes. Metal blurs, spinning wheels, the impatient music of horns that never seemed to stop. Her fingers tugged at the strap of her backpack as if to ground herself in the chaos. And then she saw him. The old man stood a few feet away, right at the edge of the crosswalk. His cane trembled like it had no strength left, his hat tilted crookedly, and his lips pressed together as if he were holding back the fear that had crept into his chest. His eyes darted back and forth across the road, following each car that sped by like hungry wolves. One step forward, then back again. His ankle shook. His entire frame seemed caught between two choices: step into danger or stay trapped on the curb forever. The people around him didn't care. A couple walked past with iced coffees, sipping cold sweetness without sparing him a gland. Key. A young man raised his phone to snap a picture of a billboard overhead, not even noticing the old man trembling right in front of him. A group of teenagers leaned against the bus stop, whispering, their eyes cutting toward Amara instead. "That's her," one girl muttered, just loud enough for the sound to travel. "The one who cleans after school." "She always looks so tired," another added, her tone sharpened with quiet ridicule. "People like her should worry about their own problems." Their words stung, not because they were new, but because they were always the same. Amara rolled her shoulder once, adjusting the strap that had rubbed her collarbone raw. She could keep walking. She could pretend she didn't see. She had enough troubles waiting for her at home, but the sight of his knuckles, white from gripping that cane so tight, rooted her in place. His breath caught like a clock skipping its rhythm, and she knew if she looked away now, he might fall into a storm that wouldn't forgive a mistake. She stepped forward. The city's noise pressed against her ribs as if daring her to move. Heat rose from the asphalt, carrying the sour mix of oil and rain long gone. She placed her shoes carefully on the white stripes of the crosswalk, testing her balance, steadying her breath. Cars blinked by like a blur of steel fish, some slowing just enough to sneer at her through glass. Amara lifted her hand, small but firm, and caught the first driver's eye. A horn blasted. Then, slowly, the car eased. Another braked. The current of chaos shifted just enough to carve out a fragile pathway. She reached toward the old man, not to drag him, not to rush him, but to stand close enough that he could borrow her courage. Her palm hovered near his arm, ready if he stumbled. He looked at her, startled for a moment, then nodded, his lips parting with a breath he hadn't realized he'd been hosed. Alding. Together, they stepped forward. The world seemed to stretch thin around them. Tires hissed as a bus swept by, close enough that its mirror brushed the air at her sleeve. Boys at the corner muttered under their breath. "Wild how she acts like some kind of hero," one sneered. "For what? Nobody's filming." The other laughed, but kept watching anyway. Amara didn't flinch. She matched her steps with the old man's, guiding him across as if each stride were a promise she refused to break. The painted stripes beneath their feet became more than lines. They were lifelines. Her chest rose and fell with the rhythm of his cane tapping, steady now, no longer trembling. When they finally reached the far curb, the old man let out a breath that sounded almost like relief and disbelief combined. The noise of the street returned to its ordinary chaos, but inside Amara's chest, silence bloomed. She had done it. She had carried him across a river of noise and danger, and now he stood safely on the other side. But as her fingers tugged at the frayed strap of her backpack again, the whispers followed. "Look at her," someone said, loud enough to sting, "pretending she's a hero in patched shoes." Heat climbed to Amara's cheeks, but she didn't turn back. She straightened her spine, gave the old man a small nod, and began to walk away. She hadn't done it for applause. She hadn't done it to prove anything. She did it because no one else had. And though the town's voices mocked her, the old man's eyes lingered on her with something different, something that felt like recognition. What Amara didn't know was that this single moment, this choice made in the middle of roaring traffic, would be the spark that changed everything. The morning after felt the same as any other, though Amara carried a heaviness she couldn't quite name. The streets buzzed with their usual rhythm, scooters whining, buses exhaling smoke, and voices risked, in 100 conversations that never cared for her footsteps. She tugged the strap of her stitched backpack higher, its fabric biting against her shoulder, and tried to shake off the sting of yesterday's whispers. Still, the memory clung to her like damp cloth. Look at her, pretending she's a hero in patched shoes. Her shoes tapped against the cracked sidewalk as she walked towards school, each scuff sounding louder in her mind than the honking horns. She passed the bakery on the corner, where the warm smell of bread curled out like a hand trying to comfort her. She closed her eyes for a second, breathing it in, wishing the sweetness could follow her all the way home. But home had no smell of bread. Home smelled of leaking pipes, soap too watered down to last, and worry that filled every corner. By the time she reached the schoolyard, she could already feel eyes trailing her. A group of girls leaned near the gate, their laughter sharp enough to cut. "That's her," one said under her breath, though loud enough for Amara to hear. "Helping old men cross the road like she's in a movie." "She's probably hoping someone will hand her a medal," another whispered back, smirking. Amara kept walking. She'd learned long ago that answering only fed their fire. But her cheeks warmed, and she rolled her shoulders once, as though the motion could shake the comments off. She headed to class, her patched shoes squeaking faintly against the tile. After school, her day never ended. While others poured into cafes or went home to laughter and meals already waiting, Amara hurried to the corner shop where she scrubbed shelves, folded boxes, and swept floors until her arms ached. The pay was small, but every coin mattered. When she finally walked home at dusk, the sky bruised purple, she could already see the shape of their little house ahead, walls tired from too many seasons, the row of patched with sheets of tin. Inside, her mother bent over the sink, hands deep in soapy water. She wore the same faded apron she always did, tied loose at the back. Amara's younger brother, Isaiah, sat at the small table, scratching numbers into a battered notebook with a pencil that had been sharpened so many times it was barely an inch long. "You're late," her mother said softly, though her voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. "They kept me after to stack boxes," Amara replied, sliding her backpack onto the chair. Isaiah looked up from his work, his small brown eyes wide. "Amara, why did people laugh at you today? I heard them outside the shop." His words were innocent, but they struck deeper than any insult. Amara froze, caught between the truth and the shield she always tried to build for him. She glanced at her mother, who kept scrubbing, her silence heavy. Then Amara crouched beside her brother, placing a hand gently on his notebook. "Because sometimes," she said carefully, "kindness looks foolish to people who've forgotten what it means, but that doesn't make it wrong." Isaiah's little brows furrowed, as if he were trying to fit her answer into the small world he knew. He nodded, though she could see confusion still clouding his face. The night moved on quietly. They ate what little they had, rice stretched with broth, bread hard but warm. The roof groaned when the wind pushed against it, and the faucet whined when her mother filled the kettle. But inside they made do, as they always had. Later, when the house had settled and Isaiah was asleep, Amara sat by the small window with her books spread before her. She tried to study, but her thoughts kept circling back to the crosswalk. She saw again the old man's cane trembling, the way his breath had caught, the way his eyes had looked at her afterward, not with mockery, but with something else, something quieter. She wondered who he really was, why his eyes seemed to see more than anyone else's. She wondered if she looked foolish for stepping forward, or if maybe, just maybe, someone had understood. What she didn't know was that the same old man miles away sat in his wide farmhouse kitchen, the glow of a lamp catching the lines of his face. His cane leaned against the wall, no longer trembling. He thought of the girl with patched shoes, the one who had reached for him when no one else would. And in that silence, his mind began to turn, already weaving her act into something far greater than she could imagine. Amara closed her book, rested her chin against the stitched strap of her backpack, and let her eyes drift shut. The whispers still hurt, but beneath them, something else lingered, something she couldn't name yet. A seed had been planted, and soon the whole town would feel it. The afternoon sun leaned low, pouring gold across the cracked streets and washing the town in a tired kind of light. Amara was at the sink, scrubbing a pan so worn the metal glared back at her in dull circles. Her arms ached from the shop work, her shoulders stiff from carrying the stitched backpack all day. Isaiah sat at the table with his elbows spread, drawing pictures of trucks in the corner of an old notebook, humming softly to himself. Their mother moved slowly across the room, folding laundry with the weight of someone who had folded more than she could ever keep. It was quiet, the fragile kind of quiet that feels like a balance. Then a knock struck the front door. It wasn't a neighbor's knock. Neighbors tapped lightly, like they were embarrassed to be heard. This one was firm, deliberate, each rap shaking the thin wood as though the sound itself carried authority. Amara froze, water dripping from her hands into the basin. Her mother glanced up, brow furrowed. Visitors never came. Not here. She wiped her misses on her apron and crossed the tiny room, her steps slow, cautious. With a small breath, she pulled the door open. There he was, the old man from the crosswalk. But he didn't look the same. He wasn't the frail figure clutching his cane as though the street might swallow him whole. He stood tall now, his shoulders straight, his boots pressed firmly against the porch boards. The cane was in his hand, but it rested lightly, more like a habit than a need. The late sun framed him, sharpening every line of his face. Behind him, rumbling softly, was a farm truck. The wooden bed was stacked with crates, each painted with a name so familiar it stole the air from Amara's lungs, the name of the largest farm in town. Her mother stammered, uncertain. Can I help you, sir? The man's eyes shifted past her, landing on Amara, where she stood near the sink. His gaze softened, recognition blooming like he'd been waiting for this moment. He touched the brim of his hat and gave a nod. You didn't recognize me that day, did you? His voice was calm, strong, nothing like the thin, fragile rasp she'd heard in the middle of traffic. Amara wiped her damp hands on a towel, suddenly self-conscious, as if the patched skirt she wore and the chipped plates on the counter had betrayed her. She shook her head, unsure whether to speak. He stepped inside, careful not to scuff the frayed rug beneath his boots. His eyes swept the small home, not with pity, but with a kind of understanding that made her chest tighten. He glanced at the patched walls, the ceiling that leaked when it rained, the chairs held together with nails and hope. He didn't frown. He didn't turn away. Then he bent slightly, setting one of the crates down on their tiny table. Apples gleamed inside, red and perfect, their skins shining like treasure. Beside them sat loaves of bread wrapped in cloth and jars of golden honey that caught the light like captured fire. The smell filled the room instantly, rich and sweet. Isaiah's humming stopped. His eyes widened, but he didn't move, too startled by the sight. The old man rested both hands on his cane, steady as a pillar. He looked directly at Amara. That day at the crossing, he said slowly, you thought you were helping a stranger, but I knew the truth in that moment. You didn't weigh the cost. You didn't wonder who was watching. You simply chose to hold on. Her throat tightened. She wanted to say she'd only done what anyone should, but her voice snagged, caught in the thrum of his words. Her mother pressed a hand to her lips, whispering a shaky, "Thank you," though the words felt too small against the weight of what sat on the table. The man's jaw flexed slightly, his lined face calm but intent. This town knows me as Elias Carter, the richest farmer in these parts. They see the barns, the land, the trucks, but wealth means nothing if I can't find someone who remembers what matters most. His gaze softened further, settling on Amara again. You showed me that when no one else would. The words struck her harder than the whispers ever had. For a moment, she forgot the sting of the girls at school, the mutters at the bus stop, the ache of her patched shoes. She forgot everything except the truth in his voice and the way his eyes seemed to see straight through her patched seams into something deeper. Her little brother finally reached for one of the apples, biting into it with a loud crunch. Juice dripped down his chin, and for the first time in weeks, the room filled with laughter. Even Amara's mother let out a small, breathless laugh, wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. Amara stood frozen, the towel still clutched in her hand, her pulse racing. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't expected thanks. But as Elias Carter straightened and leaned more firmly on his cane, she realized something with a jolt of fear and wonder. That moment at the pub. Crosswalk was only the beginning. The wooden table groaned under the weight of the crates, their rich scent spreading into every corner of the small house. Apples glistened like polished jewels, bread still warm beneath its cloth wrapping, honey jars gleaming gold. Isaiah leaned close, his small fingers hovering over the food as though it might vanish if he touched it too quickly. Amara's mother pressed her hand to her chest, torn between gratitude and confusion, her breath unsteady. Amara herself stood rooted near the sink, the towel still in her hand, her heartbeat hammering like it was trying to climb out of her chest. The old man's name echoed in her mind, Elias Carter. She had heard it whispered around town, seen it printed on trucks that rumbled down the main road, stamped on produce boxes in the market. Everyone knew the Carter farm. Everyone knew it was the backbone of the town's food, the source of both employment and envy. But never, not once, had she imagined that the trembling man she helped at the crosswalk was him. Elias leaned gently on his cane, not as a crutch but as a marker of steadiness. His eyes swept across the room again, pausing at the peeling wallpaper, the cracked window patched with tape, the uneven chairs worn down by years of use. He didn't look away. He didn't grimace. Instead, his face softened in recognition, like someone who knew these kinds of rooms, who remembered their weight. "When I stood at that curb," he said, his voice low but firm, "I wasn't just afraid of the traffic. I was afraid of what it meant, that no one in this town would stop for me, that I had lived so long, built so much, yet could still be invisible when I needed a hand." Amara's throat went dry. She gripped the towel harder, trying to understand why his words felt aimed not only at himself but at her. "You came forward when no one else did," Elias continued. "You didn't hesitate, didn't ask who I was, didn't look around to see if anyone was watching. You just chose to steady me." Her mother cleared her throat softly, voice trembling as she spoke. "Sir, she's always been like that. Even when we had nothing left in the pantry, she shared with neighbors who had less. I keep telling her we can't afford kindness, but she trailed off, shaking her head. Her eyes flicked to her daughter with quiet pride. Elias nodded, his jaw tightening for a moment as though her words confirmed something he already believed. "The world often tells us that kindness is a weakness, something for fools. But I've lived long enough to know the truth. It is the greatest strength." He reached into the inside pocket of his worn coat, pulling out a folded envelope. The edges were creased, the paper thick, official. He placed it carefully on the table beside the bread. The farm's seal was stamped in dark ink across the corner. Amara's mother inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her mouth. Amara stepped forward, uncertain, her fingers itching to touch the envelope, but too afraid to claim it. "This is a scholarship form," Elias said. "The farm sponsors one every few years, but until now, I hadn't found the right person. You may not think yourself worthy, child, but I do. Not as charity. Don't mistake this for pity, but as an investment." Amara blinked at him, her lips parting. "Why me?" The words escaped before she could stop them. His eyes steadied on hers, and for a moment the noise of the world seemed to fall away. "Because when the whole town looked past me, you didn't. Because you carry more courage in your patched shoes than most do in polished boots. And because this town needs to be reminded of what real wealth looks like." Outside the half-open window, the murmur of passing neighbors slipped in. "Is that Carter's truck? What's he doing there?" One voice hissed, another lagged. "Head cruel and cutting, probably dropping scraps. Poor girl must have begged." Heat rose to Amara's cheeks, but Elias turned his head toward the sound, his jaw tightening. He tapped his cane once against the floor, the crack sharp and final. Then his voice lowered, edged with steel. "Let them talk. They've measured their worth in coins and gossip for too long. You," he turned back to Amara, "you've already proven yourself richer than they'll ever be." Her eyes stung, hot tears gathering before she could stop them. She tried to blink them away, but one slipped free, streaking down her cheek. She dropped her gaze, ashamed of her own emotion. But Elias didn't flinch. He didn't look at her tears as weakness. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice steady. "You gave me more than help at that curb. You gave me proof that kindness still lives in this town, and I don't forget something like that." Amara finally reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the envelope. It felt heavier than paper, heavier than ink. It felt like a door opening, though she couldn't yet see what lay beyond. Isaiah leaned forward again, biting into another apple, juice dripping down his chin. He grinned through the sweetness, and their mother let out a soft, disbelieving laugh that broke into something freer. For the first time in a long time, the room didn't feel like a cage of struggle. It felt alive. Amara stood there, her hand pressed against the scholarship envelope, her chest aching with emotions she couldn't name. Gratitude, fear, hope, it all tangled together. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but deep inside she felt it. The moment at the crosswalk had planted something, and Elias Carter had come to make sure it grew. The news spread through the town faster than rain across cracked pavement. By the next morning, whispers clung to every street corner, each one sharper than the last. Elias Carter's truck had been seen outside the Johnsons' Houghton. And the sight alone was enough to stir the town's restless tongue. "They must have begged," someone muttered outside the market. "I heard she's trying to act like his little charity case," another added, loud enough for Amara to hear as she passed. Their words sliced into her, though she kept her chin high, eyes fixed straight ahead. At school, the stares were worse. Students who once ignored her now turned with smirks or narrowed eyes, their voices dropping into hushed cruelty. A girl in a pressed uniform, hair tied neatly with a ribbon, leaned toward her friends as Amara walked by. That's the girl he visited. Can you believe it? Elias Carter, the richest man in town, at her house. Another scoffed. Probably just leftovers. He felt sorry for her patched shoes. Laughter followed like a shadow. Amara's throat tightened, but she didn't break stride. She found her seat, opened her book, and willed her hands not to shake. She told herself their voices didn't matter. She told herself kindness was never wasted. Yet beneath her steady face, shame gnawed at her ribs. After class, the hallway buzzed with rumors. "Did you see the crates in their kitchen?" one boy asked, exaggerating with wide hands. "I heard he brought them food like beggars." Another snickered, adding, "She's probably hoping he'll adopt her." Amara stopped at her locker, pressing her forehead against the cool metal, her palms flat to steady herself. For a moment, she wished she could shrink small enough to disappear. But then she remembered Elias Carter's words, the way his voice had cut through the gossip with truth. "You've already proven richer than they'll ever be." The memory steadied her just enough to lift her head again. That evening, as the sun dropped low, Amara hurried home. Her patched shoes kicked dust from the road, each step fueled by a restless energy she couldn't name. She found her mother at the small table, carefully rolling dough with flour-dusted hands. Isaiah was perched on a chair, swinging his legs while nibbling on one of the apples from Carter's crate. The smell of baking bread, real bread, their bread, filled the room, softening the edges of a hard day. But even home couldn't silence the voices outside the window. Two neighbors lingered in the yard across the way, their silhouettes dark against the fading sky. "Did you see the truck again?" one whispered. "Yes. It was parked near the shop earlier. I swear he's up to something. Why else would a man like him bother with them?" Amara froze in the doorway, fists clenching at her sides. Her mother caught the look on her face, set the rolling pin down, and walked over. She brushed flour from her hands and cupped Amara's cheek gently. "Don't listen," her mother whispered. "Let them talk. They've nothing else to do. Let the bread rise higher than their words." Amara leaned into the touch, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to believe her mother's calm. But when the night settled and she lay awake on the thin mattress she shared with Isaiah, the words of the town swarmed her thoughts like flies. Was she foolish to have stepped forward that day? Did her kindness look like desperation to everyone else? Yet each time the doubt pressed too deep, she saw his face again, the way Elias Carter had looked at her, not with pity, not with scorn, but with recognition. As though he had been waiting for someone like her, as though he saw something no one else did. The town could mock her all it wanted, but Elias Carter had not come to their homes. He had come to hers. And Amara couldn't shake the feeling that whatever path had opened, it was only just beginning to reveal itself. The morning began with the scrape of a chair against the floor and the smell of apples in the air. Amara blinked awake to see Isaiah crouched on the table, his legs folded beneath him, sketching a crooked apple tree into the margins of his notebook. A real apple, half-eaten, rested beside him. The sight made her chest ache, not with sadness this time, but with something warmer. For the first time in months, her little brother had food in his stomach without her mother pacing the kitchen, counting pennies. The envelope from Elias Carter still sat on the table. Its seal seemed to glow in the dim light, as if it had been waiting all night for her to find the courage to open it. Amara brushed her fingers across the edge but didn't break it yet. She wasn't sure she could handle what it promised, or what it demanded. Her mother moved around the small kitchen with a quiet dignity that hadn't been there before. She set bread to rise, straightened the crooked chairs, and tied her apron tighter. There was a new steadiness in her step, the kind that came when worry loosened its grip even a little. By afternoon, the rattle of Elias's truck filled their street again. Amara stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun as he climbed down. Today, he carried no crates, just a steady gaze and a leather satchel in his hand. "I've spoken with the school," he said simply. His voice was clear, unshaken. "The scholarship is yours, if you'll take it." Amara's lips parted, but no sound came. Her fingers tightened on the strap of her patched backpack. "Why me?" she whispered again, the question that wouldn't stop haunting her. Elias studied her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Because when others measure worth by coins, you measure it by action. Because I saw more strength in your choice at that crosswalk than I've seen in men twice your age with 10 times your wealth. That's why." He shifted the satchel into her hands before she could argue. Inside lay new textbooks, their spines stiff, the pages uncreased. The smell of fresh paper hit her like a shock. She had borrowed, begged, and copied for years, but never owned books like these. Study, Elias said. Not just for yourself, but for what comes after. The world needs minds that remember compassion. Her throat tightened. She could only nod, clutching the satchel to her chest. For her mother, Elias had another offer. Honest work at his farm, wages steady enough to pay bills without fear, meals that wouldn't leave the children hungry at night. Amara watched as her mother's eyes welled with tears, her hands pressed together as if holding a prayer she had forgotten how to say aloud. That evening, as dusk wrapped the town in shadows, Amara sat at the table with one of the books open before her. Isaiah leaned against her shoulder, tracing the pictures with his small finger. Her mother, exhausted from her first day in the fields, hummed softly while peeling potatoes. The room was still poor, still patched and worn, but it felt different, alive. Hope threaded itself into the cracks like light finding its way through shutters. Outside, neighbors still whispered when they saw Carter's truck parked at their house. Lucky girl, some scoffed. He'll tire of her soon enough. But Amara barely heard them now. Each page she turned, each bite of food Isaiah took without guilt, each sigh of relief from her mother's chest, these drowned out the town's cruelty. That night, before she closed her eyes, Amara whispered into the dark, almost afraid. To believe it. Maybe kindness isn't foolish. Maybe it's the beginning of everything. And somewhere, far across his vast land, Elias Carter stood at the edge of his fields, cane in hand, eyes lifted to the stars. He too whispered to the night, "She has no idea what she's begun." The town had always noticed Amara, but never like this. Before, she had been the background of their streets. The girl with patched shoes, the one balancing grocery bags heavier than her frame, the child cleaning chalkboards long after the other students had gone home. They had seen her without really looking, judged her without really knowing. But now, with Elias Carter's truck rumbling down her street every morning, people's stares carried a new weight. At school, it was impossible to blend into the shadows. When she stepped out of the truck and adjusted her stitched backpack, whispers rippled like wind through tall grass. Some kids pressed their noses to the classroom windows, astonished that the richest farmer in town had taken it upon himself to drive her. A boy near the door muttered, "That can't be her," as though her patched skirt disqualified her from even sitting in the passenger seat of such a vehicle. Another girl smirked to her friends. She must have tricked him. Old men get soft easy. Amara kept her head high, though her heart pounded in her chest. She moved through the halls with the same quiet dignity her mother had taught her. Walk steady. Don't let their words shape you. But inside, the noise was deafening. She carried kindness like armor, but even armor grows heavy when every step echoes with laughter not your own. In class, things began to shift. With the new textbooks Elias had given her, Amara no longer copied notes from borrowed pages or waited for a teacher to explain what she couldn't afford to read herself. She studied at night until her eyes burned, waking before dawn to squeeze in more before chores. Slowly, her hand began to rise more often when the teacher asked questions, and when she answered, the room fell silent, not out of respect, but out of disbelief. "Since when did she know all that?" a boy whispered once, his tone caught between mockery and fear. The teacher, who had always watched her with polite indifference, began to look at her differently too, noticing, expecting, encouraging. That shift, quiet as it was, meant more to Amara than any applause. Meanwhile, her mother's presence at the Carter farm stirred its own set of tongues. The women who worked beside her marveled at her speed, her persistence, the way she carried herself with pride instead of shame. But others in town said she'd been given a gift she didn't deserve. "Work is work," one neighbor scoffed, arms crossed on her porch. "She's not special just because Carter took pity on her." At night, Amara listened as those words drifted through the window, her fists clenching under the blanket she shared with Isaiah. Yet each time the doubt crept in, her little brother's voice pulled her back. "Amara," he whispered once, his eyes shining in the dark. "Does this mean you'll go to college someday?" She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat nearly breaking her voice. "Maybe," she whispered back, brushing his curls with her fingers. "Maybe someday." Outside, the town kept watching, some with envy, some with suspicion, some with hope they didn't want to admit. They muttered that she was just lucky, that Elias would soon forget her. But Amara knew better. Luck didn't explain why she studied harder than anyone else. Luck didn't explain why her mother's back straightened with dignity each morning in the fields. And deep down, though she couldn't say it aloud, she felt it. This wasn't luck at all. This was the harvest of one simple choice she had made at a crosswalk. And Elias Carter, watching quietly from the porch of his farmhouse, knew it too. He had seen towns rise and fall, fortunes come and go, but rarely, so rarely, had he seen someone carry kindness through hardship without bending. He tapped his cane against the wooden boards, the sound sharp in the evening air. "She has no idea," he murmured to himself. "No idea what she's about to become." The weeks slid into one another, but for Amara Johnson, each one carried the weight of a shift. Her mornings no longer began with dread alone. Instead, she rose before the sun, her patched shoes waiting by the door, and opened the new books Elias Carter had placed in her hands. The pages smelled of promise, ink and paper, sharp and clean. She traced each word with a determination that burned brighter than the lamp on the table. While the rest of the town still slept, she memorized formulas, recited poetry, and filled the margins with notes until her fingers cramped. At school, whispers didn't stop, but they began to change. Once, her classmates mocked her for being poor, for wearing clothes that never matched, for carrying a backpack held together by stitches of thread. Now, their whispers carried confusion. They watched her hand rise again and again with answers, her voice calm, her words steady. Teachers, once accustomed to overlooking her, began to pause after her responses, nodding slowly, their eyes flicking across the room as if to say, "Did you hear her? Did you see what she just did?" One afternoon, during a math lesson, the teacher posed a question that silenced the room. Even the brightest students sat with furrowed brows, scratching pencils against paper, unsure. Amara lifted her hand. The room froze. The teacher called her name and she stood, her patched skirt brushing against her knees. With clear, deliberate words, she solved the problem step by step. When she sat down, the room didn't laugh. It didn't whisper. It stayed silent, the kind of silence that only comes when something undeniable has been revealed. But with recognition came sharper stares. The same students who had once dismissed her now eyed her with envy, their pride bruised by the idea that the girl they had mocked might be rising higher than they ever dreamed. A boy muttered to his friend, "She thinks she's somebody now." A girl sneered, "Carter's truck doesn't make her smart." Yet beneath their bitterness lay something new, fear. At home, her mother returned from the Carter farm with stories of long hours, yes, but also of fair pay and honest treatment. She stood taller these days, her voice carrying strength instead of apology. Isaiah beamed whenever Amara showed him her notes, his small fingers tracing the lines of her writing. Their nights still carried the echo of leaky pipes and rattling windows, but laughter slipped in too, unfamiliar but welcome. The town, however, could not stop speculating. At the market, women leaned over vegetable bins, their voices sharp. "Why her?" one asked. "Plenty of children in this town could use help." "She must have flattered him somehow," another replied, adjusting her basket. But others began to wonder. A quiet man near the bread stall said, "Maybe he sees something we don't." His words hung in the air, unsettling the certainty of their gossip. Amara noticed it most when she rode in Carter's truck. Heads turned, conversations stalled. People watched as though trying to solve a puzzle they didn't understand. Some shook their heads in disapproval, others simply stared, unsettled by a shift they couldn't control. Through it all, Elias Carter remained steady. He never explained himself to the town. He simply drove Amara to school, handed her books, and walked the fields beside her mother. But often, when Amara caught his gaze, she saw something in his eyes that unsettled her more than the whispers. It wasn't pity, it wasn't charity. It was something deeper, heavier, like recognition mixed with expectation. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the rooftops, Amara sat on her porch steps, hugging her knees. She looked down at her patched shoes and wondered aloud, "Why me?" Her mother, washing laundry in a basin nearby, glanced up. "Because, child," she said softly, "when everyone else looked away, you didn't, and sometimes that's enough to change everything." Amara wanted to believe her. She wanted to trust that her choices, small as they were, mattered. Yet deep in her chest, a restless knot twisted tighter. She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was building, something that would pull her into the very center of the town's gaze. And Elias Carter, sitting on his wide farmhouse porch, cane resting against his knee, knew it was only a matter of time before that knot unraveled. The school auditorium had never held so much noise. Wooden chairs scraped against the floor, programs fluttered in restless hands, and voices spilled into the air like waves crashing one over the other. The annual award ceremony was a tradition in the town, but for Amara Johnson, it felt like a stage she had no right to stand on. She smoothed her skirt with trembling palms, her patched shoes planted firmly against the polished floorboards, and tried to steady her breath. The scent of chalk, perfume, and old varnish mingled in the air, a mixture both familiar and foreign. Isaiah sat in the audience beside their mother, his legs swinging wildly as he craned his neck to see. Their mother's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white, though her eyes never left the stage. And just 2 seats down sat Elias Carter, tall even in his old age, cane resting against his knee, his weathered face calm but alert. His presence alone sent a ripple through the crowd. Whispers rushed between parents and students alike. Why is he here? Who's he come to see? The principal's voice rang out, bouncing off the walls, reading name after name. Students walked across the stage, collecting certificates, bows, and brief applause. Amara listened, half drifting, until she heard it. Her name, Amara Johnson. Academic excellence. The words seemed to split the air. For a second, the room hesitated, as if it couldn't quite process what had been said. Then a smattering of applause began, small at first, then growing. She rose slowly, every eye pinning her in place. Her heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out the clapping. Step by step, she walked forward, each click of her patched shoes against the floor echoing in the silence between bursts of applause. Whispers chased her even now. Her? No, it must be a mistake. Carter must have pulled strings. She's Jiao. Her. The words were sharp, but she kept walking. She lifted her chin, not in defiance, but in quiet determination, the way her mother had always told her to. On stage, the lights were blinding. The certificate was handed to her, crisp and official, and her fingers shook as she took it. She turned slightly, facing the crowd. Rows of eyes stared back, some doubtful, some mocking, and a few, just a few, surprised enough to hold wonder. She bowed her head slightly, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. Gratitude for every night she studied until her eyes burned. Gratitude for her mother's sacrifices. Gratitude for the hand she had offered on that chaotic day at the crosswalk. Then, from the audience, a sound cut through the chatter, a cane striking wood, once, twice. The auditorium quieted. Elias Carter stood slowly, his frame steady, his gaze sweeping across the room. He didn't need a microphone. His voice carried with the weight of someone who had worked land and commanded storms. This girl, he said, his hand pointing toward Amara, once stood in the middle of traffic to guide a trembling old man across the road, not knowing who I was, not caring. She held steady when no one else did. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes her remarkable. The room hushed, all whispers silenced. Parents shifted in their seats, students leaned forward, teachers froze in the wings. Amara stood there, her certificate trembling in her hand, her cheeks burning under the stage lights. Elias tapped his cane once more. You measure wealth in coins, in land, in polished shoes. I tell you this, wealth is measured in courage, and this child carries more wealth in her heart than half this town put together. The crowd erupted, not all at once, but in waves. Some clapped hesitantly, others with conviction. Her mother rose to her feet, tears streaming, clapping harder than anyone. Isaiah stood on his chair, his small hands smacking together, his face glowing with pride. Amara bowed her head again, tears finally slipping free. For the first time in her life, the town wasn't mocking her. They weren't ignoring her. They were forced to see her. And in that moment, beneath the burning lights, she understood. Her act of kindness had grown into something none of them could deny. But what she didn't yet know was that Elias Carter's speech wasn't just about the past. It was leading to a truth he had been carrying quietly, a truth that would shake the entire room when he finally revealed it. The applause still echoed in the rafters when Elias Carter lowered himself back into his seat. The wooden floorboards seemed to hum with the sound of hands clapping, the sound of disbelief breaking into something else, something closer to respect. Amara stood frozen under the hot stage lights, the certificate trembling in her grasp, her cheeks wet with tears she hadn't meant to let fall. She had thought the moment was over, thought the crowd would shift to the next name, the next applause. But Elias wasn't done. He rose again, cane in hand, and this time the room stilled immediately. The murmurs, the whispers, the frowns, all silenced by the weight of his movement. He stood straight, taller than most men half his age, his weathered face carved by years in the sun and soil. His eyes swept the room once more before settling firmly on Amara. You've all known me for decades, he began, his voice slow, deliberate. You've bought my crops, worked my land, envied my barns. You call me the richest man in this town, but wealth means little if it ends with me. Gasps flickered through the audience. Teachers leaned forward, parents tilted their heads, even the principal shifted uneasily. Elias tightened his grip on the cane and continued, his voice gathering strength. I have no heir, no son, no daughter to carry forward what I've built. For years, I thought that meant my work would die with me. But then, on a crowded street, in the roar of traffic, I found what I had been searching for. I found someone who reached out, not for reward, not for recognition, but because she could not watch another fall. His hand lifted, pointing at Amara. Her breath caught in her chest. The entire room followed his gesture, hundreds of eyes locking onto her at once. "This girl," Elias said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, "is proof that courage and compassion are stronger than wealth, and I will not let her light go unnoticed. Today I tell you all, Amara Johnson will not just have my scholarship. She will have my land, my barns, my farm. She will inherit everything I own." The words cracked through the air like thunder. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped their program. A mother clutched her child's arm. A boy in the back muttered, "No, no, that's impossible." But Elias's face held no doubt, no hesitation. Amara's knees buckled slightly beneath her, the certificate nearly slipping from her hands. She gripped the edge of the podium to steady herself. Her patched shoes, the very ones mocked for years, now stood on the stage of history being rewritten. She could hear the rush of blood in her ears, the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out the crowd. Her mother pressed both hands to her mouth, tears spilling freely, her shoulders trembling with sobs. Isaiah stood on his chair, shouting her name, clapping so wildly he nearly toppled over, and Elias Carter, steady as stone, looked at her with eyes that held nothing but certainty. "Do not mistake this," he said to the crowd, his voice sharp. "This is not charity. This is not pity. This is recognition. She is the future of this town, whether you accept it or not." The auditorium erupted, some in applause, some in outrage, some in stunned silence. But for Amara, the noise fell, dead into a blur. All she could feel was the weight of Elias's words, pressing into her chest, reshaping everything she had believed about herself. She had been the girl with patched shoes, invisible, mocked, dismissed. Now she was being named the heir to the richest farm in town. She lifted her head slowly, her tears glistening under the stage lights, and for the first time, she didn't bow under the weight of the town's gaze. She met it, steady and unflinching. Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, offering a hand at a crosswalk, wasn't small at all. Sometimes it was the spark that could rewrite an entire destiny. And on that night, in that auditorium, the town finally understood.